welcome to Pluribus Unum's Fireside Chat. Not as good as FDR's, but hey, it's something. Hope you enjoyed the 200th episode, and if not, well, you won't be facing a big episode like that in a while, and not even for the 700th subscriber special. That's probably going to be safe for like 1,000 subs, or my next 100th milestone, or generally if I get bored. We're basically going back to basics for a while now. Back to basics, but improved upon. With that out of the way, let's get right into the news. First, I'm going to be talking about this update on Honduras. Remember a while ago when I said that the Honduran president was to be extradited and we were waiting to figure out what was going to happen? Well, Honduras said, yeah, they're going to be extraditing the former president, Juan Orlando Hernandez, to the United States to face charges of drug trafficking. In fact, it was a unanimous decision. It was unanimous in the Honduran Supreme Court on whether or not to do this. And it seems like honestly, Xiomara Castro seems to be doing alright. She doesn't seem to be having the Pedro Castillo problem, where he's effectively bogged down by his own government, so that he has to do anything to try and stay relevant. So, yeah, I mean, honestly, this is a good thing. Trying former leaders for their crimes is a good thing, all things considered. And I'm glad that it's actually being done, especially considering our leaders in the United States can do whatever the hell they want and apparently don't face any consequences. Like, literally, think about it. When was the last time a US president has suffered actual consequences for their actions? Like, I mean, we had this big show during Watergate, and there was an attempt to put Trump on trial for actions, but still, they roam free. Well, Nixon don't roam free no more because he's dead, but you get my point. Another piece of foreign news that has been circulating is something that I haven't really been able to talk about for a while. I knew this was happening, but I wasn't entirely sure of the situation. But now things are finally coming out to fully explain the situation in English, so I can finally understand what's going on. For those who have absolutely no clue, which is probably a good majority of you, let me explain. I've been seeing a lot of things going on like the Mexican Twitter accounts I follow, like AMLO's Twitter account, Mario Delgado's Twitter account, the Morena account, the PT account. A bunch of them were targeting the INE, and many of them were suggesting reforming the INE in some form. The thing is, I wasn't entirely sure what the situation was, but now I finally understand what this is doing. You see, AMLO is planning to change the electoral board of Mexico. For those who don't know, I think it's, whatever it's called, it's like the national election thing. The INE, like, it has a meaning, but it's, like, the E is obviously electoral, but I don't have the exact acronym with me. Basically, it is the elections board. They, make sure people get on the ballot, put ballot questions and stuff, that sort of stuff. Well, AMLO has been sort of facing some problems with them, especially considering they have not necessarily been happy with AMLO's referendums. For those who do not know, AMLO, one of the big things that he's been pushing is to have referendums to like, when he ran for president, he said that he was going to do all these big things, but he knew that a lot of people might not like that, so what he did was that he would put all of his big positions to a vote. The Mayan train, the jailing of past presidents, that kind of stuff. And if those referendums passed, he would then move forward with his plans, and if they failed, he would just say, okay, scrap that, let's try something else. And here's the thing, referendums, of course, are a good thing, but one of the big things that has been a problem is that these referendums are technically non-binding, because Mexico doesn't have the infrastructure for binding referendums yet, which is what AMLO's trying to do with these referendums. And two, as the referendums have been going on, many people were noticing that a lot of the referendums had very low turnout. The Mayan train one is a very controversial one, because that one, he basically said, I want to build a train through Mayan territory, and then a slim majority of the population, it's not even a slim majority, it was like barely 2% of the population voted in that referendum, and not a lot of the people who voted in that referendum would actually be impacted by it. And many indigenous people said, hold on, shouldn't we have a say in this? And AMLO tried to justify it, but it was like, that was definitely not his best moment as president. It also led to some conflicts with the Zapatistas, all this kind of jazz. And people were saying, like, AMLO's using this very slim majority in this referendum to justify big changes in Mexico, but AMLO's stating, like, basically, with each referendum, more people turn out. Because he wants to make these referendums so recurring that they will, like, actually have an impact on Mexican politics. To the point, like AMLO obviously has ambitions far beyond his tenure, and he's trying to build a brand new Mexico. That's why it's called the Fourth Transformation, because this would be the fourth transformation to Mexico, from the Reform Wars, the Revolution, the Independence, and the fourth transformation will be the fourth one. Like, this is a brand new Mexico from scratch. The INE has not necessarily been reciprocative of these referendums. The biggest referendum that they're having problems with now is the referendum on AMLO's term. Because again, let me explain for those who don't know. One of the big things AMLO ran on when he was running for president was that in the middle of his term, he would put himself back on the ballot. Basically, he would put a question. Here's the question. The question is scheduled on the 10th of April, which is coincidentally when something else here is scheduled, but we'll get to that when we get to that. The question is, do you agree that Andrés Manuel López Obrador, President of the United Mexican States, should have his mandate revoked due to loss of trust, or that he should continue in the presidency of the Republic until his period concludes? Basically saying that for those who don't understand the question, because the question is really long-worded, it's basically saying, should AMLO stay in office or not? Or should AMLO be recalled? The more accurate title would be. If a majority of the people say that AMLO should be recalled, then AMLO will resign and then pick someone else to be the replacement. And if they say no, AMLO stays in power, the INE has been causing a lot of issues with this referendum, because they feel this is a waste of money, you're just doing this to, like, increase your power or something like that. It's basically what this is a popularity contest. Like I said, technically a majority of people could vote for AMLO to leave, and then he just stays in power because it's a non-binding referendum. But the thing is, AMLO's using this as a popularity thing, because AMLO is still really popular. So he's basically using this as a sort of reinvigoration of Morena and PT and all the other people in his coalition, or like his supporters. Honestly, I thought Va por Mexico would actually be really reciprocative of this referendum, but apparently they haven't been. Which is why AMLO has actually started announcing that he plans on trying to reform the INE. And the reform, like, when I heard him say he wanted to reform the INE, and, like, he was attacking the INE, I was a little bit skeptical. I'm like, okay, what's going on? What's going on? What do you mean by reform the INE? Because, I mean, that could be scary, but from the way he's wording it, he's explaining, like, what he wants to do is reform the INE so that the people who are in charge of the INE are people who were directly voted on by the populace. And I'm pretty sure that might mean this is going to be the thing that is going to be tackled in his next referendum. So, yeah, I actually don't oppose that. I'm not necessarily a supporter of it, but it's like, if AMLO thinks that's best, then, I mean, let's see. Let's see if it works. Let's see if it's a good idea. I mean, this could be a really terrible idea, or this could be a really good idea. We're going to have to wait and see. AMLO's been doing fine so far, so I don't necessarily see any problem with him trying to experiment, especially considering his experimentation seems to be going really well. Speaking of things that are going really well, I'm going to have to give a huge hand to Ketanji Brown Jackson, who is going to be nominated and actually going to be on the Supreme Court, because Suzanne Collins announced that she will be voting to confirm Ketanji Brown Jackson, which essentially puts her at the 50 votes needed. So really, there's no really no point to pay attention to anybody else. I mean, either Cinema votes for her and then that gets to be a 51, or she doesn't and, well, we still got 50. So Ketanji Brown Jackson is going to be put on the court. So, yeah. There's not much else to say on that regard, because, I mean, she hasn't been confirmed yet, so this is basically just me saying it's all but given that she's going to win. Speaking of winning, I'm actually going to take an interesting leap and talk about the Missouri Senate race, because something really interesting happened in this race that I think might be an indicator of something that might be really good. Okay, so for those who don't know about the Missouri Senate race, Missouri is a Senate seat that most people on our side of the aisle, well, if you're a lefty progressive type, probably wouldn't be paying attention to. However, a person entered the field that has kind of been turning eyes, including my own, to think maybe this might actually be a lot more interesting than I think. Okay, so for those who don't know, this seat is basically red-leaning. Like, it's very expected that this seat is going to be red. I mean, it was held by a Republican. The Republican has announced that he's not going to be running for re-election. But the thing is, you might say, well, it's a deep red state. How is this important again? Well, you see, Missouri has this weird thing about being a deep red state. Basically, the way I describe them is when you mix red and blue, they get purple. But if you put on a little extra red, it gets a little, reddish. Basically, Missouri, I think, is sort of like that. Originally they did have Claire McCaskill in the Senate before Josh Hawley replaced her. And it's the same state of Cori Bush, so there's definitely blue streaks there. But the problem is you just have to find the right person. And it seems like somebody entered the plate that actually seemed to make a very interesting case. The person in question is named Lucas Coons. Coons is a former Marine Corps officer, which is actually a common occupation for the Missouri Senate candidates. The Democratic nominee for this seat in 2016 is Jason Kander, who was an Army colonel. But Coons is running a very interesting campaign. You see, Coons is running a sort of a rural populist type campaign. You see, normally in these seats, Kander did this himself. They would run on stuff like, oh, we're basically they ran as Republicans, but in the Democratic primary. Kander had an ad it was actually a really good one, where he was like, I believe in Second Amendment rights, but I also believe in blah, blah, blah. And he was saying this, he was doing this big speech about gun rights and, gun control, while he was blindfolded and fixing a gun from the Army. But basically they were we're sort of a middle of the road types. Republicans are okay on some regards. McCaskill was the worst of them all because she actually had to govern like that. And the problem is, when you run as Diet Republican, what are you going to do? Essentially what's going to happen is they're going to go with the regular. And if you want proof of that, 2018 Missouri Senate race, that's exactly what happened. Well, Coons is sort of running, again, like I said, he's running a rural populist campaign similar to Richard Ojeda, but arguably a bit different. Coons was even featured in a Hill article with John K. Fetterman and Erica Smith, where they're basically progressive, it's basically this new trend of progressive legislators who are running on basically everything progressive except for the label progressive. Coons sort of has the same viewpoint. He doesn't explicitly run as a progressive, but he runs on basically all of the progressive issues, Medicare for all, ending tax cuts for the rich, a Marshall Plan for America, fix all of their broken areas, stuff like that. And, this has actually been working really well, because in the race, Coons is one of the largest donor getters. He's been getting a ton of money from a lot of people who are actually very interested to seeing his message. And he's been getting a bunch of news appearances. There hasn't been any formal polls, but Coons does seem to be the most well-known and well-liked of the candidates. He's been getting a bunch of endorsements from across the U.S., Vote Vets, Progressive Change Campaign Committee, the League of Conservation Voters, and a couple of state-affiliated people. Many people are wondering, hey, this guy actually has a decent shot. Which is why somebody named Trudy Bush Valentine entered the race. For those who do not live in Missouri, Trudy Bush Valentine is a nurse and daughter of beer magnate August Bush Jr. He's the one responsible for the brand Anheuser-Busch. The daughter of a beer magnate is entering the race. And lo and behold, 3 candidates decided to drop out of the race to endorse her. Thomas Schneider, the mayor of Florissant, who's running a centrist-oriented, independent bid, Tim Shepard, an LGBTQ rights activist who was supposed to be running as a progressive, who I took seriously for a second, but then I realized, no. I mean, I didn't endorse him before just because I was like, Kuntz just objectively has a better shot at winning, but now Tim Shepard is clearly a fake. And the most prominent one, Scott Sifton, a former state senator who was basically running as the moderate candidate in the race. They all basically said, okay, race is over, we have to endorse her. But Kuntz has made it very clear that he's going to be remaining in the race. And while on paper, we should probably be like biting our nails like, oh no, this is really bad, really bad, really bad. I actually look at this and think, I actually think this is a good thing. Because a similar thing is happening in Pennsylvania with the aforementioned John K. Fetterman. Like a decent number of candidates have dropped out, and now the field is basically consolidating around like 4 people. A nobody, Malcolm Kenyatta, who's running as a fake progressive, Connor Lamb, and Fetterman. And Fetterman still has like a 30-point lead. And now they're basically like, hey, we need to run an extremely harsher campaign towards Fetterman. And the same thing is happening here. People are, like a progressive, at least in values, is running and is doing really well. And now, basically, they're trying to pull a thing in the field to try and make sure that doesn't get any better for him. Like, we'll get this trust fund kid to run against him. The same thing happened to Nina Turner. They got scared because she was basically running away with the race. So, like, the Israeli PACs were like, money, 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 throw money. Basically making it rain on Chantal's campaign. The Democratic majority for Israel had to basically announce at the beginning of the year, yeah, these are like a bunch of campaigns that we're endorsing. Don't look into them. We're endorsing all these candidates. No particular reason. And it's like, wait, all of these races are like incredibly winnable and incredibly viable for progressives. Progressives are growing power and getting more prominent within the party, and as such, the establishment is getting scared. I think this is basically the last leg that they have before they can officially just give in. The fact that we're scaring them enough to the point where they are actually like having to pull out a bunch of these stops to try and win shows that we are winning. But as much as I want to be confidently say like, yeah, we're winning, there's no point in fighting anymore. But it's like, no. We have to make sure that these guys get in. Because once they get in, that's when things start changing. Like, I mean, the squad in the House is great and all. But remember, Bernie's still alone. Like, Merkley and Markey, they can't help that much. Like, those guys, no offense, they're all 3 old men. That ain't what we need. We need people like Kuntz. We need people like Fetterman. We need people like Barnes. We need people like, well, actually, those 3 are really all we need at the moment, because those are the only 3 progressives in the Senate that are pretty viable. Well, technically Peter Welch is there, but he's also an old man. And essentially, I think he's running to basically be the replacement Bernie. Kuntz has given me some Ojeda vibes, and I think we should be paying attention to him a little bit more, even if it's just like let's see where he's going. Speaking of where is he going. It looks like Madison Cawthorn's answer to that will be the unemployment line. Because Madison Cawthorn, like, Republicans have been getting really, really mad at Madison Cawthorn. So now, a bunch of people are throwing their weight behind a primary opponent to Cawthorn, including Tom Tillis, the senator from North Carolina, who is endorsing Chuck Edwards, who is running against Madison Cawthorn. And was quoted as saying, it comes down to focus on the district, producing results for the district, and in my opinion, Mr. Cawthorn hasn't demonstrated much in the way of results over the last 18 months. Like, Cawthorn is probably on his way out, all things considered. Like, I mean, I don't know. To be fair, I don't know if he really is on his way out. He could still win. But I think if he does lose, I think this will actually be proved to be a viable lesson for progressives. Because if that's the case, then I got news for you. This proves the case that AOC is doing something right. Bear with me here. What has Madison Cawthorn been doing his entire term in Congress? He's essentially been trying to be like the obstructioner. Like the Republicans like, oh yeah, these blah blah blah. Like, he's essentially trying to be the obstructionist. The guy who's loud, mean, and trying to like, oh, I'm trying to push the Republican Party super, super far right. And not working with any people. I'm not toning down my rhetoric. I'm not doing all this. I'm not doing all that. In fact, actually, it seems that he actually toned up his rhetoric because he originally ran as like sort of like a normal conservative, but then he became like a super big Trumpite. Okay, but how does this turn back to AOC? Well, AOC turned down her rhetoric. She came in originally with like the obstructions plan, like, oh yeah, I'm the big bad. I'm gonna make the establishment like super scared. I'm never gonna work with any of them. They're all corporate shills, blah blah blah, all that stupid jazz. And like, oh, the Republicans are super bad, and oh, Nancy Pelosi's an evil bitch, or blah blah blah, like all that jazz. She came in with that, and then she toned down her rhetoric to basically be like, okay, now we're gonna focus a little bit more on actually trying to push. Like, I mean, basically for her first term, she was essentially that. And then for her second term, she basically toned it down a little bit, and then, tried to be a bit more of like a legislator. And that's where things started getting better. Okay, I think a more accurate way would be like the first half of her term, and the second half of her term was basically like first term was like that, trying to be a bit more conciliatory. And that's when things started getting a bit more noticeably interesting for her. That's when like the attacks started happening, and that's when that's when actual things started happening that were because of her. And she's still in Congress, being able to push this agenda. She didn't get this big, massive, like corporate-backed primary opponent. Like Michelle Caruso-Cabrera did run, but she was basically a nothing burger. Like, I mean, this is one where it's like literally the senator from Cawthorn's home state is endorsing an opponent to him. If AOC did half of the stuff that Cawthorn did, then that's exactly what would have happened. Every single senator would have endorsed the opponent of her, with the exception of like Bernie and maybe Markey, because Markey and her worked on the Green New Deal together. This is a valuable lesson. Like, being the screaming loud person isn't always gonna win. In fact, all it does is make you look stupid. Going into Congress and essentially being the obstructionist, like, oh yeah, I'm going to stop everything good from happening until we get the super, super, super good thing, isn't gonna work. And I've proven this a million times over. Alan Grayson did this strategy. He lost re-election and didn't get anything done. The Portuguese left did this, and they lost really hard during their midterms. And while we're at it, going into debates and going, ha 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 ha, you're a shit lib, ha 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 ha, you don't understand communism, ha ha, AOC suck, la 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 la. That doesn't win you either. Instead, it makes you look like an idiot. And this is what's happening to Cawthorn right now. He's looking like an idiot who can't even get the support of his own party. Hopefully, we'll be able to get Cawthorn out and be able to replace him with someone better. Speaking of persons who are trying to get into Congress, bombshell just hit. Remember 2008? Yeah, 2008 is relevant again because Sarah Palin has announced that she's going to be running for Congress in Alaska. Oh boy, oh goody. And here's the interesting thing. There's a good chance that she is going to win this seat. Because Sarah Palin, still relatively popular, all things considered. She's at the very least going to be making it to the, not the runoff, well, yes, the runoff. The question is, who's going to be the rest of the people in the runoff? Like, I mean, currently there are 50 people running for the seat. Some of the candidates are very interesting. There's John Howe of the Independence Party of Alaska. There's Robert Ornlas of the American Independent Party, who was, interestingly enough, was in Montana before coming here. And also, interestingly, Santa Claus is running in this seat. I'm not kidding. There is a person who has filed for this seat named Santa Claus, who is part of a city council in the North Pole, who's apparently running as a socialist. Not a socialist party candidate, but like, he's like running as like his Twitter account is like, I'm a Bernie-crat progressive socialist, and it's like, okay, that might be interesting. But essentially, most people basically theorize that Palin's going to make it to the runoff. But the question is, who's going to fill the remaining 3 slots? If I had to take a guess, it would be Nick Bagkinch, because he's like the nephew of a prominent Democratic senator and like the son, like the grandson of like a prominent Republican governor. So I speculate there's going to be a lot of those like moderate-ish Democrats who are basically Republicans that are going to float over to his candidacy. Al Gross, who was the Senate candidate in 2020, like, he's definitely going to make it to the runoff. he'll basically suck up the majority of the remaining Democratic vote. So it'll be like 70% of Democrats will vote for him, and then like 30% will vote for Beginch because they're like, oh hey, I remember Mark. The last slot, I have no clue who's gonna be. Like the biggest one that many people have been putting out is a girl by the name of Tamara Sweeney, who's like a native Alaskan, who's a conservative Republican. She's probably gonna be there, but I also wouldn't be surprised if it's like an oddball, like, oh, what if J.R. Myers, who's also running in the seat, actually manages to win? We'll have to wait and see how things pan out. Maybe Santa Claus will make it to the runoff. We'll have to wait and see. Speaking of things to wait and see, let's move on to the main topic of this video, the French presidential election. Remember back when I was talking about that referendum? Well, the French election is going to begin on that day. I say begin because apparently France is going to be holding a week-long election. I don't necessarily know why, but it's going to be held from the 10th to the 14th. So this video comes out essentially a week before the election happens. So this is basically where you can get the final details of like how's the race going to pan out. Let's also give France a round of applause. They're the only white country that actually has a somewhat interesting election to talk about this year. No more applauding the whites. Alright, let's talk about the election itself. First, why am I talking about this one? Well, to get a little bit of history about this, we're going to have to go way back to France during World War II. Don't worry, it's not going to be too long. But France, we all know the story about France during World War II. France was like, we are normal people, and the Nazis were like, hello, and then stormed in and took over France. There was some people who fought back, but France was basically defeated very easily. There was some underground resistance, but effectively, the USSR and the USA and Britain had to basically bail out France. And after France was taken over by the Nazis, they basically briefly attempted to continue on with life as they were. But eventually, they were like, we kind of don't want to go back to the way things were. Because after that, like, Nazi thing, I think we gotta have to, do a reboot. Which is what led to France to devolve and reform into the Fifth Republic. And basically, the Fifth Republic basically brought in a ton of new changes to the France political scene. One of the biggest ones being that the French could now actually have a say in the choice of their president. If an Adam Ruins Everything episode does not fail me, which to be fair, there's a good chance that it does, France essentially has an electoral college structure, which means that the people do get a say in their president, but the say is a little, shall we say, mixed. But one of the ways that this Fifth Republic's politics changed was essentially if you look into the great men theory of history, which is part of history, I should probably make a video about, like, what form of history is correct. Spoilers, I'm going to have to say a little bit of everything. But essentially, the French political scene is divided in a sort of, not necessarily like 100%, but essentially the French political scene is boiled down to two figures. Charles de Gaulle, the first president of the Fifth Republic, who was the leader of the Nazi resistance. Just because I think it worded that weird, he fought against the Nazis. That's what I make that clear. He fought against the Nazis. And another political figure named François Mitterrand, the first socialist president of France. If you could take a wild guess, Charles de Gaulle basically represents what the mainstream right wing likes to focus their attention on, and the mainstream left wing models himself to François Mitterrand. Much like how in America, the modern day right basically boils itself down to like Trump, and Bernie is the left guy. Or how in Mexico, essentially, if you were left wing, you'd essentially boil your politics down like, oh yeah, I support the Cardenases. The Fifth Republic has had 8 presidents and 11 elections, but I think things really started kicking ahead with the election of Nicolas Sarkozy. Sarkozy was a very noticeably right-wing president, and that led to a lot of people basically going like, we kind of don't want this. Can we get something else? And that's when Francois Hollande was elected instead. Like when he was in the 2012 election, it was Sarkozy versus Hollande, and Hollande won. And while originally people were thinking like this would be a very interesting change, but it turns out Hollande was essentially of the right wing of the Socialist Party. By that I mean he was essentially like it's hard to describe him. Like, I wouldn't describe him as a Warren. Maybe he would be a Warren. He did endorse Hillary, so maybe he is a Warren. But essentially, he was like a sock dem who, like, I mean, if he were on Twitter, he would definitely be a sock dem who would use the sock emoji. In fact, he might actually be one of the ones that would be a sock globe emoji person. So things did not necessarily bode well during the Hollande presidency, especially when there were a lot of other factors that were being put into place. Like, remember, 2012 was when we started getting the rise of Islamic terrorism and mass Islamic immigration. And much like how in America, Hollande basically removed the one big wedge issue, gay marriage. So now there had to be a new wedge issue, which was now mass immigration and essentially white nationalism. You know the people that are the people who claim they're not racist, but they're like, oh, but the demographics change. I mean, we do have a lot of mass immigration, and they're not really assimilating into our Western values. I mean, we were all around on YouTube at that time period, so we know what's happened. Which essentially led to Hollande becoming the most unpopular leader of the Fifth Republic and choosing to not run for re-election. And a far-right figure managed to enter the scene to basically try to impose Trumpism in France. But then, funnily enough, similar to America in 2020, a centrist entered the scene and said, no, I'm not going to let that happen. And a man named Emmanuel Macron managed to become the president of France, despite the fact that even though Hollande was of the more centrist wing of his party, they nominated a centrist, but oh well. Macron would definitely be one of those 100% globe emoji people. The people that would unironically be like, yeah, I'm a neoliberal, so what? Again, to make the comparisons to us, he would basically be an Obama or a Clinton. Bright, shiny face, but essentially neoliberalism, but with a shiny new package. Justin Trudeau is a prime example. Miguel de Madrid, Enrique Peña Nieto. This is a common thing that just happens. Macron was one of those hey, how you doing? One of those nice, good-looking people who happens to basically be I'm a cool new centrist. And that was essentially what he was. He was basically, I'm going to stop the far right. And he did that. But aside from that, that's essentially all he did. He did do things, but essentially, at this point, we're essentially in the beginning period. We all know how this works. I mean, we're lefties. I mean, a majority of us are. But we see how this works. The bright, shiny centrist enters, and the first time around, it's oh, this looks cool, this looks great. But then, near the end, things start going, we're starting to see the problems. And that's essentially what's happened with Macron thus far. He's gotten into some controversies and some issues, one of which we're going to be getting into. But essentially, he hasn't reached the boiling point yet. Much like Enrique Peña Nieto. I keep using him as an example or Obama. I'm using them as examples because you understand what I'm saying. At the beginning, things looked hunky-dory. We got the new hope and change we want, and hopefully we get a bright, shining glimmer of hope. But then as things start going on, we kind of start noticing the issues. With Obama, things didn't become a lot more noticeable until during 2012, where it was oh yeah, the bright, shiny glow on Obama had faded. He was now an old man. And now we understand that he wasn't necessarily living up to the expectations that we wanted. Same thing for Enrique Peña Nieto. He went from going in and everyone's hopefully he'll fix Mexico. And then people were glad that he was leaving. But we're still in that stage for Macron. Macron's still in his honeymoon phase. And he won't be around next time for the honeymoon phase to crash. But is that necessarily accurate? Because I wrote that after doing a little bit more research in the past couple of days. And let's just say that assessment might not 100% be accurate anymore. But we'll get into the first controversy, the big controversy that everybody in the West seemed to understand, seemed to see. But, weirdly enough, it's weird. Let me explain. For those who don't, You all remember. If you're a good majority of my audience is lefties. You know what I'm talking about. The Yellow Vest movement. Macron, early on, he tried to do this thing where he's like, I'm going to raise oil prices and then cut taxes on the rich. And people basically all across the political spectrum, regardless of their ideology, you got people from the far right, the far left, basically everybody, a bunch of workers got really mad and then basically did a massive protest against him. And the thing was that it was basically like a bunch of a bunch of blue collar workers, but in France, like for people of those kind of jobs, they usually wear a yellow vest because they're talking about like construction workers. So it was called the Yellow Vest movement. Basically, think of if the Tea Party and Occupy went on a trip to France together, and then, Tea Party's sitting there minding his own business, Occupy shows him a little leg, and they're like, oh, ooh. And then they go into, they have a little fun in France, you know what I'm saying? And then they have a little baby. That's basically what the Yellow Vest movement was. We all remember this because the American left got extremely obsessed with the Yellow Vest movement for a little bit. I remember when the Yellow Vest movement was everywhere, we had people starting shows that were literally just like, I'm going to start the new Yellow Vest movement for America. Except there was one thing about the Yellow Vest movement that nobody seemed to bring up. The Yellow Vest movement got their concessions on December 10th, 2018. And yet I remember the Yellow Vesters in America were still going on and on and on about it up to late 2019. They had literally gotten what they wanted, and then the Yellow Vest movement literally disappeared as soon as COVID happened because people weren't in the mood to protest, at least in France. America, we basically just donned masks and got right to it. And I say we, as in the colloquial we, not me, because I didn't protest because I'm not a protester, because I'm fat and lazy. Anyways, that was all the setup. Now it's time to get into the actual election, the candidates in it. What are the issues? To be honest, the issues are basically standard for every single election at this point. COVID, economy, but now we got a new issue entering the scene that I won't talk about quite yet. I want to get through the candidates first, and then this issue will come up, because it's become very prevalent in the recent final days of the election. Let's go into the candidates first. Now, the way France works is that they have a they have a lot of parties and a lot of political factions in certain groups. Like I said, there was the Francois Mitterrand and Charles de Gaulle, but then you also have divisions within those like left and right movements. And believe it or not, they actually allow many movements of these parties to go together. Like there are coalitions that sometimes get built. Sometimes there's like massive divisions within the movements. I won't spoil it yet, but there's one side of the aisle that's very, very heavily divided. Meanwhile, another has basically gone through with very little division. But one of the big things that this election seems to be is a 2017 repeat. Like 2017 was basically like the year where France's elections, like France's political system basically did a complete different change. And this one might be the same in that regard, but also the same in the sense that 8 out of the 12 people that are running are candidates from the 2017 election, including the incumbent, obviously. But as you can see, that's quite a very big majority of them. With that out of the way, let's get into the candidates themselves. I was divided on how I was going to structure this video because, originally I was like, well, I just do how they are ideologically or whatever. But I felt it was kind of weird to start off ideologically, so it's better to start with the main man himself, Emmanuel Macron. He's the incumbent president, obviously. He's the candidate of La République En Marche. It's a centrist liberal party that was formed during the 2017 election. I've already explained, Macron's essentially a neoliberal, there's not much else to say here. He represents the radical center of the political spectrum in France. The two sides are basically doing everything they can to try and get him. And as I said, these sections have sections of their own. First, we're going to start off with La Gauche. For all you English sayers, the left. First, on the extreme fringe left, we have Nathalie Arthaud. a teacher and perennial candidate of the party Lutte au revoir. I am probably pronouncing that wrong, so I'll include the English name as well. Workers' Struggle. Workers' Struggle is a Trotskyist political party, and as I said, she's the most extremely fringe left-wing candidate. The next candidate is Philippe Poutou. He's a trade unionist and another perennial candidate. He's running for president under the New Anti-Capitalist Party, a broadly far-left party that was founded in 2009, rejecting the old-school leftist ideologies to, quote, build a new socialist democratic perspective for the 21st century. For those who don't know why that's the case, let me explain. In the 2008 or 2007, whatever year was the election cycle, I think it was 2008, in that election cycle, a bunch of the far-left parties actually did really well, and Poutou basically figured that if all of these far-left parties worked together, they could actually form a very viable bloc and actually be very good at winning an election. Now, these two are part of a section of the left, but this section is slightly more broad than I originally thought, so I'm giving them their own mini-section. These two are the extremely fringe left parties. Maybe you can call them like the ultra-left or whatever. The next section, which is the more mainstream part of this bigger section, is the candidate Fabien Roussel, who's a member of the National Assembly running under the French Communist Party. A communist party which essentially started off as like one of those like essentially like we all know how communist parties usually begin. They're like hardline ML, but the French Communist Party has done what most communist parties around the world have done, and essentially broadened their philosophy to slowly enter the mainstream political discourse. They're still not quite there yet, but they're getting there. And next is the leader of this faction, and I'll get into the name of the faction in a second, but the guy in question is a man by the name of Jean-Luc Mélenchon, a prominent left-wing politician and perennial presidential candidate running for the candidacy of La France Insoumise. It's a left-wing populist party that is formed to essentially be the middle ground between the center-left and the far-left. Now, this is where I have to explain this thing. Like, what's the section that I keep alluding to? Well, this section is essentially everyone from Mélenchon to his left. This section is called the anti-liberal left. The anti-liberal left are basically everybody in France who's on the left who basically refuses to work with liberals. Like, you know, liberals are bad, liberals are evil, and we need like a hardline left. But there's a reason I divided these two sections. Roussel and Mélenchon, they are more conciliatory, especially Mélenchon nowadays. Mélenchon is basically he was originally a super hardliner in the 2017 election, but now he's essentially trying to be like, okay, now I'll be a bit more conciliatory. And Roussel, with the Communist Party's shifting ideology, has essentially branded itself to be another middle ground party between the center-left and the far-left. But, of course, the center-left is still around, and that's where we enter into the liberal left. The left wing that has something that most leftists hate. The ability to work with liberals. The biggest figure in the liberal left, I guess you could say, I think, is Anne Hidalgo. She's the mayor of Paris and is running as the candidate of the Socialist Party, the former main center-left party of France. Now, I didn't get into the problems with the Socialist Party, but I'll get into them now. See, when I said François Hollande did not want to run for re-election, that didn't mean the Socialist Party didn't run a candidate. They did run a candidate, Bennet Haman. And lo and behold, he did not do so hot because Hollande's presidency was so bad that, like, Bennet Haman? I'm pretty sure I'm pronouncing that right. He had to leave the Socialist Party and form a brand new political party because of how bad his results in that party were. And the Socialist Party still is kicking around, despite the fact that the Socialist Party actually did for a brief moment consider not running a candidate because They just didn't have the momentum behind them. But Hidalgo's still here, giving the Socialist Party one more chance to try and win. But the most liberal of the liberal left is Yannick Jadot, a member of the European Parliament representing the Europe Ecology, the Greens. It's an environmentalist party. Now, he originally had like an eco-socialist person who was running against him for the nomination, but Jadot is essentially the more like centrist candidate. Jadot did run in the last election, but he actually dropped out before the election actually happened to endorse Haman, I think. And those are the lefties. And even though I mentioned Mélenchon third to last, he's probably the most prevalent that you might know, especially recently. But we'll get into that when we get to that. Why don't we head to the other side of the aisle, La Droite. First, we'll start off with Jean Lassalle, a member of the National Assembly and a 2017 presidential candidate, who's a candidate of Resistance. And when I was doing research and looking into this party, I was really hitting my head over the fact that a left-wing French party hasn't named themselves La Resistance, even though it's basically gift wrapped to them, but we'll put that aside. Resistance is interesting because it's essentially a party just for Lassalle. It's literally just a party for him because he's not necessarily a right-winger. He came from a centrist political party originally, but he's essentially been put into the center-right. So he's basically to the slight right of Macron. Okay, there's not much else I can really say about him. He's just running as a vanity project. The next candidate is Valérie Pécresse, former member of the National Assembly and current president of the Regional Council of Île-de-France. She's the candidate of Les Républicains, which is the main centre-right party of France, modeling itself after Charles de Gaulle. What's funny is that originally she was considered the saving grace for the French right, but things have changed very drastically, and we'll get into why in a second. Well, not in a second, in a little bit more than a second. Next is Nicolas Dupont-Aignan, member of the National Assembly and running under the party Debout la France. It's a party that split off from La Républicains, well, their predecessor to La Républicains, because he blamed them and the Socialist Party for being, quote, jointly responsible for the sinking of our ship France. Basically, he thought that the Republicans were too far left for him to get behind them. Alright then. Next, we're going to be talking about candidates who feel very similarly. First, we have Marine Le Pen, member of the National Assembly, 2017 presidential candidate, and daughter of notable far-right French politician Jean-Marie Le Pen. If you have it put together, this is the person that Macron was basically around like, I'm going to beat her last time, to which the French say, haha, yes, you're going to beat a woman, and they're like, but no, I mean as in like an election. And they're like, oh. She's a candidate for Rassemblement National, also known as the National Rally, a far-right political party that basically rode the populist wave of Donald Trump. Basically, their pet issue was like, oh, we got these massive amounts of immigrants coming to us from Muslim countries, and they're not assimilating into our culture right. You know, basically that kind of stuff. And originally, she was poised to basically do the same thing, except one interesting thing happened. A person entered the race and decided, I think she's a little too left-wing. A man by the name of Eric Zemmour, a journalist who is running under a party called Reconquête, also known as Reconquest, I think it is. It's a party that is to the right of Le Pen, and Zemmour has called his ideology Gallo-Bonapartist, basically saying he's a mix of Charles de Gaulle and Napoleon Bonaparte. Now you might say, I remember Le Pen being extremely far right back in the day. How could someone be to her right? Is he like an actual full-blown fascist? Not quite, but here's the thing. Le Pen, due to the fact that she's a politician, she had to tone down her rhetoric. You see, that's always how it is when you're a politician. You gotta tone it down a little bit. But Zemmour is a journalist. He has no reason to censor himself. And as such, he didn't. He made him, like, a lot of things very bluntly clear about his ideology. Like, he at point blank stated, quote, "I am nostalgic and reactionary." And this is another thing. Le Pen, her thing was like, oh, we need to make sure that they assimilate to French culture and they respect French culture and blah, blah, blah. But Zemmour is literally like, Muslims must choose Islam or France. As you can see, this guy is definitely not to her left. And, as you could probably put together, those two were the ones who basically floated to the top of the French right wing. And there has not really been much division outside of who of those two do you want to support. Meanwhile, the French left has basically been pretty much evenly divided amongst all of those candidates. Okay, well, to be fair, more Mélenchon, Roussel, and maybe Jadot. But there was one person who did actually have an idea to try and fix this. Christine Taubira. She was a candidate for the French left, and she was basically trying to run as like another center left-ish candidate, and she wanted to basically unite the French left together under one banner. So there was something called a people's primary, where a bunch of the mainstream left-wing candidates contended to run as a united front. Taubira put herself into recognition. Like basically, here's what they said. They said Hidalgo, Jadot, Mélenchon, and Taubira. Why don't we all work together to try and unite under one banner? We can work out whatever problems we have later. But the point is now, Macron has steadily shifted to the right, so he's now basically center-right. And we're going to have like a far-right contender with Le Pen or Zemmour, so it's best for the French left to unite under one candidacy. Now that seems well and good, except there was one problem. Nobody cared. Well, scratch that. Christine cared, but that was it. Jadot dropped out the last cycle, so he didn't want to do it again. The socialists flat out admit to refuse that they're a dead party, and Mélenchon was already polling the highest, so there was really no point in him even considering contending, because the rest of the people were center-left, so he had figured, if I continue and contend in this primary, there's a chance that the center-left is going to be a little too afraid of me, so there's no reason I should contend. And surprisingly, Christine Taubira won, and then she said, okay, I won the people's primary, hooray! So you guys going to drop out now? And they were like, what? We didn't even contend. Like, the other three didn't contend formally. Hidalgo, Jadot, and Mélenchon were basically written into the primary. And like I said, Mélenchon, he was the biggest contender. Like, if Mélenchon basically said, no, we don't care. And without Mélenchon, there was no point in even having a people's primary. And what's worse is Taubira didn't even qualify for the election. They held this primary before she even qualified. And here's the worst part. After she dropped out, they endorsed Mélenchon, even though he got third in the primary. So again, literally, there was no point in him contending at all, because he knew he had all the cards to play. And as you can see, things have essentially been boiling down to a four-person race. Zemmour and Le Pen are basically fighting over the right-wing control of the electorate. Mélenchon is essentially leading the left wing of the delegation, and the electorate who basically wants status quo is basically going to vote for Macron. However, something happened that made all four of these people basically have to shuffle their candidacies last minute. The invasion of Ukraine, because each of these guys had very prominent positions that were basically shifted drastically after the Russian invasion of Ukraine. First, Mélenchon. Mélenchon has been one of those fiercely anti-NATO leftists. Because, I mean, that's a big thing on the left nowadays. Like, you have to be anti-NATO. That's one of the big things on the left. And he previously had made statements supporting the Crimean annexation by Russia. And he even was like one of those like Russian tanky types, basically blaming the entire invasion on American imperialism very early on. Like, that was basically his position very early on in the conflict. But as the conflict continued, and this has become basically mainstream political discourse for the entire world, he's essentially changed his position. He's now not doing pro-Russian talking points, and has basically become my position, radical pacifism. He's still anti-NATO, like, he still openly says, like, we need to leave this useless organization, but he's basically changed his rhetoric in regards to it. Meanwhile, the right has had to do the biggest changes in their platform. Like, you see, Le Pen, originally, one of her big things was that she was friendly with Putin. Like, oh yeah, me and Putin are like best buddies. We met together during the 2017 election, and basically that was her big thing. Like, and she would pass out like flyers, basically like, look, it's me with Putin, because Putin's a right-winger, so right-wingers around the world are very supportive of him. And Le Pen basically had the same thing. And I think she basically tried to do the same thing, where she was like, oh yeah, well, it's just Russia's fault. But then again, she basically had to do a complete 180 in her platform, and basically had to denounce Putin and said all this bad stuff about Putin, and even had to destroy tons of campaign memorabilia that had Putin on it, because of how bad that it would look as her passing out pictures of her with Putin. Meanwhile, Zemmour, he doesn't have the relationship with Putin, but it was pretty clear that he wanted it. He basically made columns basically saying like, Putin's great, Putin's amazing, and how he wanted a French Putin. Now he's again had to tout anti-Putin stuff now. But one interesting thing about his platform that I think actually I didn't even consider, because you see the BS about it normally, that you actually don't expect this. You see, remember how Zemmour and like Le Pen basically tout like the super anti-immigration rhetoric stuff? And how it's basically just code word for brown people? Well, for Le Pen, that seems to be the case. But apparently, not for Zemmour. For Zemmour, his rabidly anti-immigration views apparently do not stop at brown people, and he frequently called out, like, we shouldn't be allowing any Ukrainians inside of our borders. And it's like, oh. And surprisingly, a lot of French people do not support that, so they're like, yeah, no. But interestingly enough, the one person that hasn't had to change much, and in fact the Ukraine situation has actually benefited them very greatly, is Macron. You see, Macron, the way Macron is, because of his like super centrist views, and especially how foreign policy was apparently one of his strong points because he went to school for it, put him in the most prime position right now, especially since not that long ago, Angela Merkel, the Chancellor of France, recently left office. So now, Macron is essentially the new leader of Europe. Basically, Europe turned to her for guidance, and now it's Macron's turn. And a lot of Macron's stances seem to be actually paving really interesting for, like, Europe. Europe has actually been looking at him basically saying, like, oh, I think he's actually kind of right. Now, basically what he's been saying is that he believes that Europe should not rely too much on America and NATO to bail them out, and instead, Europe needs to be focusing on building its own defenses, and that NATO is effectively a bad organization. While to be fair, the NATO is a bad organization part, he was quote-unquote proven wrong on, but Europe has actually been listening to the part where he says, we need to stop relying on them as much, and we need to be relying on our own military prowess. And a lot of European countries are actually like, yeah, we should probably do that. There's also the part of like where war usually favors incumbents very greatly. So that part is, of course, head steadily for Macron. But that's basically most of the events of the campaign. Now let's take a look at some polling. Polling has essentially made it so, like I said, those four are essentially the ones at the top. The one, like, Valerie is the one that is usually, like, put fifth, but essentially it's just those four, Macron, Le Pen, Zemmour, and Mélenchon. Macron has basically consistently been near the top. Le Pen and Zemmour usually flip-flop for second. You know, the French hard right is like, which one do I support now? Do I support Le Pen or do I support Zemmour? And Mélenchon has steadily placed himself in third, and the last seat is usually reserved for whichever right-winger the France does not like the most. Now, interestingly, I thought that Le Pen would be consistently in fourth, and early on, she was basically like the second highest polling of the far-right candidates, but it seems that she's managed to regain her support. I think it's a mix of Zemmour is, like, I mean, many people are like, okay, Zemmour is a little too radical to me, in my opinion, and Le Pen is just like a more recognizable name. And maybe people are just like, Le Pen did fairly well against Macron last time, so maybe she has a chance this time around. And speaking of, the way France works is a lot like Latin American countries. If a candidate can't get 50% in the first round, they go to a second round. And second round polling has essentially only focused on Zemmour, Mélenchon, and Le Pen against Macron. They haven't really entertained like Zemmour versus Le Pen or Zemmour versus Mélenchon or Le Pen versus Mélenchon. They've really only been focusing on Macron versus whichever radical people like the most. And the way polling has been done shows Macron v. Zemmour, with Macron winning with 65%. Macron v. Mélenchon, with Macron winning by 59%. But what is interesting is that it seems that Macron v. Le Pen is getting interesting because it seems that things are tightening. Now it's 54-46 for that matchup. Now that's like, very interesting. What's even more interesting was a poll that was released not that long ago that many people took very interesting. It basically like trended on Twitter for a little bit, which made people think like, that's weird. And what is this poll? This poll basically asks like a bunch of the candidates, who would you support in round two? Like whichever of these candidates you vote for. You know, they had like Jadot, Macron, Zemmour, Valerie, I think, Mélenchon, Le Pen, like, and they basically said, those are your candidates that you vote for in the first round. Like, these are your candidates you support. But if it was a Macron v. Le Pen round two, who would you vote for? Now, most of the results were pretty simple. Like, Jadot had, like, a lot of people vote for Macron. It's like, that makes sense. He's, like, a liberal left guy. But the one that was most interesting was the Mélenchon voters, where it was shown that 28% of Mélenchon voters said that they would vote for Macron in the second round, 41% would abstain, but the one that caught the most people's attention was the 31% that said they would vote for Le Pen. Now, many people were like, what? Like, I mean, that is relatively shocking, all things considered. But I think it's a little bit of, like, I mean, some people have been saying, like, oh, the reason why this isn't shocking is because a lot of working class voters vote for Mélenchon, so there's a chance that a lot of them probably aren't that into, like, whatever Macron is into. Some people say, like, maybe people who are voting for Mélenchon are just dissatisfied with the political system altogether, so they basically just vote for anybody to get rid of the political system. You know, we had that with people who voted for Bernie and then voted for Trump. The reason isn't quite as important as just the fact that 31% of people would support Le Pen, especially considering this was actually very different from how Mélenchon has stated things previously and how things have just been. Like, Mélenchon, when he was go up against Le Pen, usually whenever the second round would go around, he would basically openly state, do not vote for Le Pen. Like, no matter what, do not vote for Le Pen. Like, in the 2017 election, he made it abundantly clear he wouldn't endorse Macron, but he made it very abundantly clear, you must do everything in your power to not let Le Pen become president, which was basically tacit endorsement of Macron to stop her. but without saying he supports Macron. Then people got really mad at him, and he basically said, look, tell you what, let's do a poll. We're gonna poll all the people who voted for me. What should I do? Should I endorse Macron? Should I abstain from the election entirely, or should I submit a blank vote? 36.12% submitted a blank vote, 34.83% voted to endorse Macron, and 29.05% voted to abstain. So essentially, he was making it very clear, like, okay, there's going to be some people who want for me to endorse Macron, and that's basically what you're going to get. You could get some of my voters who are going to vote for Macron, but he himself will not do so. Like, he won't publicly endorse Macron. And he's made it very clear that's what he's probably going to do again. He's going to ask his voters, what am I going to do for this election cycle? And then, like, make his choice in regard to that. However, interestingly, I don't think he stated, like, he would be opposed to endorse Le Pen. I don't think he will. I have a very decent chance that he will not endorse Le Pen, because he's run against her twice and said no vote will go to the National Front. That's his position. No vote will go to the National Front. He does not want anybody to vote for Le Pen. What he wants is for people to vote for him. Now, what's going to happen? This is the last week of the election, so what do I think will happen for this round, and what will this election entail? Well, for support, I've made it very abundantly clear from day one that I support Jean-Luc Mélenchon. Mélenchon is a left-wing populist type that I really think, he's a little nutty. So what? He's not a Galloway. He's basically like Galloway if he were still sane. But, Mélenchon, he's a pretty interesting candidate and would be a good president of France. But it's very unlikely that he will make the runoff. It's very likely that he'll at least make third, because, he's been polling recently as third, as the left has basically decided to consolidate around him. So now he's essentially, what this race is going to do is, I think, is going to basically change the French electorate again. We changed the French electorate, so basically, it used to be center-left v. center-right, but now it seems like the hard right versus the center is the mainstream. And basically, what was the center-left basically disappeared. But what it appears to be is that now, what is going to happen is that this election is going to reshape the French left. This will probably be the last election cycle that the Socialist Party actively participates in. I'm calling it now. The French Socialist Party has a good chance of dissolving during this election cycle, and La France Insoumise will probably be the one that takes its place as the mainstream left-wing party of France. They will take the mainstream of the left in France. Mélenchon might run another candidacy in the next election cycle, or more than likely he'll pass the torch to someone who is like him. The most likely scenario for a runoff is essentially Macron v. Le Pen. And that's where things kind of have to end, because recent polling has been showing the race has gotten a little bit tighter. Originally, I would have just said, oh, Macron's going to easily beat Le Pen. But honestly, after those two make it to the runoff, I honestly don't know if Le Pen has a shot. Maybe she does. Again, polls seem to be tightening, so people are definitely not as opposed to Le Pen as they were previously. And many French, sociologists or whatever the hell they are, they say, people are legitimately starting to worry that maybe this will be the case. Maybe this will be the election cycle where Mélenchon endorses Macron. Are things getting that serious? We also seen that there are some people in Macron, people who are Mélenchon supporters who would vote against Macron. So definitely we're seeing a lot of issues that would probably be, again, I don't know. We'll have to wait and see how things pan out. But I will really only care if it's a Mélenchon versus whoever else runoff. If Mélenchon makes it to the runoff, I'll be genuinely surprised. But either way, that's probably where we're going to have to wrap it up here. Mélenchon will probably change the left in France forever, but that doesn't mean he will be any close to winning. Thanks for watching this video. Be sure to like, comment, subscribe, and click that bell to notify when a future video comes out. And if you want some more content from me, you can go to my website, follow me on Twitter, join my Discord, check out my articles in the Independent Political Report, or consider supporting me on Patreon.